Joined by Siya Biniza from Politically Economy Southern Africa, who's in our Pretoria studios. Good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I suppose the first place to start is that much was expected from today's budget vote. Were those expectations met in terms of the hardline message that Minister Pravin Gordhan seems to be taking?
Yes, I think it's very clear that state-owned enterprises have reached the limit in terms of being able to rely on government guarantees or government bailouts, as it were. But I think this is important because they're creating a drag on the fiscus and they might be resulting in further downgrades in the future if we cannot contain the contingent liabilities that state-owned enterprises expose us to. But I think what's more important is to understand why we have state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are meant to be sort of the engine of transformation for the government, because the national government pretty much sets policy. Local and district government is the interface between the people and national government, and so state-owned enterprises become the implementing arm of government. And the complete failure of state-owned enterprises reflects in terms of our inability to deal with inequality and poverty, because state-owned enterprises are supposed to enable this transformation to take place by creating jobs, employing, transforming former Bantustans and townships, etc., in order to transform the economy. But what we've seen is that they've been exposed in terms of their procurement and financial public mismanagement. And so they have not been able to achieve this very vital role in terms of economic transformation.
I mean, it's only been a few months, but Minister Gordhan has hit the ground running with new boards at Eskom. Yesterday, we saw an interim board at Transnet. On and on it goes. Some of those changes are at least going to be sending the right message.
Yes, I think definitely the crisis of corporate leadership, I think, is really what's challenging our state-owned enterprises. I don't think that we have an operational challenge in terms of capacity. Otherwise, we would be seeing, say, for example, at Eskom, power stations, getting on fire or whatever. But what we're finding is that there's complete financial mismanagement and exposure in terms of procurement. And this speaks to the kind of transformational process or class-generating process that's happened post-apartheid, in that what is more important has become around the procurement as opposed to the physical implementation and delivery by state-owned enterprises in terms of transforming the economy physically. What's become more important and contested is the procurement, the tenders, and the access to cheap financing, which has been captured by different groups. And that's particularly why the whole state capture saga has been so integral and important.
I suppose, you make that point because most of these SOEs regularly make headlines for all the wrong reasons, either drowning in debt, serious liquidity challenges, more recently, of course, as you point out, being embroiled in allegations of state capture. And really the point is, without rigorous reform to their business models, the long-term survival of a number of them is in doubt. For some, the writing is on the wall, is it not?
Yes, I think we also need to be cognizant of the historical legacy of state-owned enterprises. Many of the state-owned enterprises were either captured by the apartheid state as a sort of middle-class generating enterprise, or they were created to govern over Bantustans, etc. And we all understand the policy of the apartheid state towards Bantustans and townships was underdevelopment. And so what we faced in the post-apartheid era was to transform these institutions to not only cater for a minority group in terms of the country and citizenry, but also to enable them to impart development. But what we saw post-97 with the privatization of Telkom, and partial privatization at least, and other pressures to privatize state-owned enterprises, is that they've moved away from the actual implementation and building of roads and structures and transforming physically to more access to finance, procurement, etc., which has opened up a whole loophole for capturing by elites in order to gain personally from the state-owned enterprises, instead of the enterprises doing their duty in terms of transforming the economy or plugging the economy where there are gaps, such as in the case of utilities, where it makes more sense to have a monopoly, whereas if you would privatize it, you expose consumers to high pricing. The state-owned enterprises then fill the gap by creating or providing these basic needs to the citizens at a lower or cheaper price that cannot be exploited by private interest. But what's more important is that state-owned enterprises now no longer are able to serve their transformational agenda as a result of governance challenges.
I suppose then we have to talk about what I was talking about in a moment ago, the idea of a reform in the business model to address exactly the concerns that you're pointing out. I mean, today we heard from Stats SA that unemployment remains unacceptably high, 26.7%. It is our number of the day on Prime Biz today, with access to patronage networks and all the things that you have mentioned. How do we start reforming the business model to make sure that state-owned enterprises are part of the transformational agenda?
Look, I think ideally the first step for me would be to hold executives and boards, fiduciary bodies, personally liable. I think there are a lot of bad decisions that happen because people don't have a personal liability to the decisions they make, and in many cases misguide or serve private interest as opposed to serving the national interest. And I think those monies that are lost through state capture, etc., should be recovered by the state from those parties. And I think, secondly, what's important to understand is that as a result of the pressure to privatize state-owned enterprises, they've moved towards providing financing and procurement as opposed to actual physical delivery on the ground. And I think this is as a result of the shrinking fiscal space in order for state-owned enterprises to depend on, but also this is a vastly different space from the state-owned enterprises that operated under sanctions during apartheid, which were forced to produce physically. And I think it would be a very good idea to try and move state-owned enterprises towards that, actually delivering and transforming the economy on a day-to-day basis rather than being financial houses or being huge procurement enterprises, basically. And I think lastly, what's also very important is to ensure that we separate the liability acquiring aspect of state-owned enterprise. I think that should be much better placed at the National Treasury, at least for those state-owned enterprises that aren't financial institutions or banks, etc. And to ensure that the Public Enterprise Ministry looks at governance issues, National Treasury maintains the budget and ensures the financial viability of state-owned enterprises, whilst executives and boards focus on implementing and really transforming the economy, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done out there, but a lot of the state-owned enterprises have shifted away from the physical implementation towards a bunch of duplication in terms of access to financing or procurement, etc. And I think these are the fundamental changes that need to take place in order for state-owned enterprises to play their critical role in society.
You talk about personal liability for those who are making misguided decisions or even corrupt ones. Are you encouraged, for example, if we look at Transnet's locomotive deal, the idea that that might be set aside? We know it ballooned from 38 billion rand to upwards of 50 billion rand. There was that Worksman's attorney's report that Transnet set aside, saying that it was inconclusive, lacking specifics. All that information has come out now to the fore, and it seems at least some action on it. What would you like to see happen, particularly to those who have resigned?
Look, I think ultimately they need to be held accountable, and a lot of people keep talking about accountability, but what does it actually mean? I think although we've got very good legislation in terms of the Public Financial Management Act, PFMA, it is not legislatable in many cases, and it's used as a guiding legislation. And so people constantly have this separation between them holding the position in their official capacity, which requires integrity, good governance, etc., and them holding a position because of their political deployment, which in most cases people hide behind and do not perform or do not hold themselves accountable. What I would like to see is obviously recovering the costs that have been lost as a result of mismanagement, because ultimately the citizens end up paying for these through the tax increases that we face, such as the VAT increase, the introduction of new taxes, etc. And so what is being done is that we're pardoning people who are in positions that should be accountable, and we end up having citizens pay the buck. And I think this is critically unfair, and it's fostering a culture of poor governance that's also spreading into the private sector. as we've seen with the number of scandals, not only from corporate individuals, but also from auditing firms who are embroiled in this.
Right, there will be, of course, many who will agree with you that we need to get the money, but others might suggest that the horse has bolted. Siya Biniza there on the line from our Pretoria studios.